You were never supposed to hear this story. What happened in Fort Worth, Texas, in the autumn of 1878 wasn't an accident. It wasn't the madness of a deranged doctor or the superstition of cowhands who'd had one drink too many. It was a test and experiment. A prototype of a system that would one day govern every heartbeat, every thought, and every purchase you make. 12 people died inside the Copper Bell Saloon that night. But not one of them died by chance. Their blood was the ink of an early signature written by hands you still don't see. In the years after the Civil War, America was hungry to rebuild. Railroads stretched like veins across the wilderness, pumping wealth from east to west. But beneath the gold and whiskey, the men funding it were playing a different game. They needed data, human data, bodies to test, minds to map, souls to measure. And out here on the lawless edge of civilization, no one asked too many questions when people disappeared. That's where he came in, Dr. Cornelius Weatherbe, a man of science, a surgeon from the Union lines. He stepped off the train in Fort Worth with shaking hands and a calm voice. He said he wanted to heal. But those who looked into his eyes swore they saw something else, a kind of hunger that wasn't human anymore. When he opened the Copper Bell, locals thought they'd found salvation. Whiskey that cured pain. Tonics that reversed consumption. Women walked in dying and came out laughing. Men crippled from war left dancing in the street. Miracles cheap enough to buy by the glass. But the miracles came at a cost no one understood, until the night of October 15th, when the bell rang one last time and 12 bodies hit the floor before the echo faded. Every empire begins with an experiment. And this was the first hidden behind polished mahogany and the sweet burn of whiskey. The official story said it was alcohol poisoning. 12 drunks who'd gone too far. But every corpse pulled from the Copper Bell that night told a different story. Their veins were blackened, their tongues swollen, their eyes filmed with something crystalline like frost forming from the inside out. The undertaker who prepared the bodies left town within days, refusing to speak again. He'd whispered to the sheriff before leaving, "They weren't drunk, they were changed." But who was Cornelius Weatherbe really? His papers were authentic enough. Letters from Union field hospitals. Commendations for bravery. Yet none of the men who signed those documents existed. Not one surgeon, not one commanding officer could be found in any archive east of the Mississippi. Every reference was a ghost. Every credential fabricated. Someone had built his identity like a mask and placed him in Fort Worth for a reason. Weatherbe's private notes, the ones salvaged from the fire that destroyed his office, spoke of neurological realignment, behavioral stabilization, and involuntary adaptability trials. He described his patients as samples, and above each name, he listed a code, EPI, followed by a number. In his margins, written in a hand that grew more frantic with each page, he drew a single symbol, an I, divided by a vertical line, one half mechanical. You see, the saloon wasn't just a bar. It was a human laboratory disguised as leisure. Each glass of his tonic was a dosage, an early chemical attempt to rewire human compliance. Funded by pharmaceutical syndicates from Boston and New York whose descendants still shape the industry today. The letters they sent him used a phrase long forgotten by history: cognitive obedience through administered pleasure. In other words, control through comfort. Addiction as architecture. When men drank, they didn't just lose pain, they lost resistance. When women healed, they lost memory. The tonics didn't cure, they converted, turning human will into something programmable. And Fort Worth was only the first test site. After the massacre, Fort Worth officials called it a tragedy, a misunderstanding, an unfortunate night of excess. The sheriff, pressed for answers, produced a report so vague it bordered on fiction. He wrote that Weatherbe perished in the fire, though no body was ever recovered. No bones, no ashes, no trace of the man whose concoctions had killed a dozen and cured 100 more. But the truth didn't die in that saloon. It multiplied. Within weeks, bottles identical to Weatherbe's therapeutic mixtures began appearing in neighboring towns: Abilene, Waco, San Angelo. Different names on the labels, same copper seal, and every bottle came with a promise: Restoration of the soul through tonic balance. You'd think word of the deaths would have destroyed the business. Didn't, because the tonics worked at first. Pain vanished. Disease receded. But those who drank them long enough began to change. Neighbors spoke of strange behavior, sleeplessness, trance-like obedience, voices heard when no one spoke. Farmers stood motionless in fields under the noon sun, whispering words in Latin. Wives forgot their own children's names, yet remembered complex sequences of numbers they'd never learned. And always, they described a ringing sound, faint, rhythmic like a copper bell tolling in the distance. A traveling preacher, Reverend Silas Boone, tried to warn them. He claimed the formulas contained energetic patterns, frequencies designed to weaken the mind's natural resistance to command. He said Weatherbe hadn't died, he'd been reassigned. That he was part of a larger network of medical agents working for what Boone called the Eastern Board. Boone's sermons drew crowds. Too many. On a Sunday morning in late 1879, his church caught fire before the service began. The local paper said it was lightning, but witnesses swore they saw men in black frock coats standing across the street, watching the flames in silence. The copper bell burned once, but the sound never stopped. The Eastern Board. The name appeared only once in any surviving correspondence, a letter marked confidential, recovered from the ruins of Weatherbe's office. It was unsigned, stamped only with a wax seal, the same divided I symbol found in his notes. The message was simple: continue trials, subjects responsive, expansion approved, maintain saloon facade, observe behavioral saturation. Most historians dismissed it as a hoax, but the handwriting matched receipts from a Boston consortium, a group of men who, in 1878, controlled nearly every pharmaceutical patent in the United States. They weren't healers. They were industrial alchemists, chemists, investors, and railroad magnates experimenting with human behavior long before the language of psychology existed. They believed the mind was a machine and emotion a resource to be harvested. The copper bell was their first field test in behavioral pharmacology. They called it the Fort Worth Protocol. Its goal wasn't to cure illness, it was to measure compliance. How quickly could a man surrender his will if you numbed his pain? How willingly would he obey if you replaced his suffering with pleasure? And how long would it take before he forgot the difference between the two? By the time Weatherbe disappeared, the Eastern Board had already moved on. Records from a Delaware shipping company show crates of tonic compound sent south under new names: Vitasol, Harmony Elixir, the Temperance Cure. Different brands. Same formula. Every bottle stamped with that faint copper sheen, the mark of approval from men who understood that if you could control a person's chemistry, you could control his soul. But here's the part most people never grasp. The same board that funded Weatherbe later financed 2 major medical universities, 3 patent offices, and 1 organization that would quietly evolve into what we now call public health. The institutions meant to protect you were born in rooms lined with copper bells. They learned then what every empire knows now. If you can numb the pain, you can own the mind. 5 years after the massacre, in the spring of 1883, a man surfaced in Galveston claiming to have worked under Dr. Cornelius Weatherbe. His name was Elias Pritchard, a failed chemist and occasional gambler known for selling snake oil along the Gulf Coast. When he was found, he was half-mad, burned, trembling, and mumbling phrases no one could translate. But among his belongings, investigators discovered a journal. 43 pages. Each page written in the same meticulous script as Weatherbe's own, except these words weren't medical. They were musical. The entries spoke of resonance induction, of using sound to harmonize the nervous system, to align vibrational obedience. He wrote that Weatherbe's true genius wasn't chemical, it was acoustic. That every dose of tonic was paired with a note, a frequency struck from the copper bell hanging over the saloon's door. That frequency, Pritchard claimed, was designed to open something in the human brain, a gate between instinct and suggestion. In one passage he wrote, "He discovered that pain has pitch, that fear has a frequency, and that once you know it, you can tune a man like a violin." Locals recalled the bell of the copper bell sounding different in its final months, lower, almost alive. They said you could feel it in your teeth. Some patrons even described feeling euphoric when it rang like their thoughts briefly cleared, replaced by a pure, blissful silence. That silence, Pritchard wrote, was the real medicine. A moment when the self dissolved, replaced by what he called compliance resonance. When authorities questioned him, Pritchard said the experiments were not Weatherbe's idea. He'd received instructions from the board, specifically a man referred to only as Director H. And the last order they gave before the fire: scale the resonance to groups of 100. That's when the copper bells began appearing in other towns, not just saloons, but churches, schools, even courthouses. They called them donations. They called them progress. But Elias Pritchard wrote one final sentence before he vanished. The bell rings still, and those who hear it no longer belong to themselves. When the board realized what Weatherbe had unlocked, they understood something staggering. You didn't need chemicals if you could make people sing their own compliance. By the 1890s, bells just like the copper bells hung in nearly every Texas town. Each one cast from a pattern owned by a Northern donor foundation. Church bells, school bells, courthouse chimes. They called it modernization, uniformity of sound, so that train schedules and prayers could align across counties. But what if that uniformity was the goal? Elias Pritchard's journal contains sketches of waveforms crude, hand-drawn, yet identical to the resonance curves later patented by early radio engineers. The board, it seems, had shifted its experiments from glass bottles to air itself. Sound became the new tonic. Every Sunday morning, millions would gather under steeples. They would breathe together, sing together, repeat together. The copper bells tolled at the same frequency that once opened the minds of Weatherbe's patients. But now the experiment had gone national. And it didn't stop there. When Marconi sent his first wireless signals in 1895, 3 of his silent partners were investors tied to those same pharmaceutical trusts. The board had gone invisible, its medical laboratories reborn as communication companies. The tones changed name, not function. Church hymns carried them. Patriotic marches embedded them. Even the early phonographs hummed faintly in that same range, 272 to 286 Hz, the human obedience band. Scientists later dismissed the range as harmless background resonance. But Pritchard had warned, once heard enough, the tone replaces thought with rhythm. And if you think that's superstition, look at what happened next. In 1914, the U.S. military standardized its bugle calls, synchronizing soldiers by sound. In 1922, radio networks began each broadcast day with a test tone always the same pitch. By 1939, the nation could be moved by a single voice over the air. The resonance had scaled from one saloon to an entire civilization. And you, sitting there now, have already heard it in your national anthem, in your notifications, in the chime that wakes you up each morning. Comment below the phrase, "I hear the bell." Write it twice to anchor your awareness. It isn't superstition. It's recognition. The first act of remembering that you can still choose what frequency you obey. Section 7. By the dawn of the 20th century, the copper bells had fallen silent, or so the public believed. In truth, the board had simply changed instruments. They no longer needed physical bells. They had found new conduits. Radio waves, assembly lines, and advertising. When soldiers returned from the Great War, they carried with them a new vocabulary: morale, suggestion, conditioning. The science of persuasion had been born on the battlefields of Europe. But the men funding those studies were the same ones who had once bankrolled Weatherbe's tonics. The board had rebranded itself as the Institute for Human Efficiency. Their reports are chilling to read now. Subjects respond favorably to repeated tones when paired with reward imagery. Product loyalty replicates neurological obedience. They were testing not medicine anymore, but attention, how long a human mind could be held, tuned, and bent toward consumption. And they discovered something even more powerful than the bell's frequency. Imagery. Combine sound with moving picture, rhythm with dream, and the human will dissolve almost effortlessly. When the first commercial aired in 1929, it carried a background hum so subtle most never heard it. But those who did described a strange calm, as if the world momentarily aligned. The voice spoke of comfort, purity, safety, and millions obeyed. They bought. They believed. The Institute's motto, carved into marble above its Chicago headquarters, read, "Harmony through progress." Its logo a split eye framed by a stylized bell. By the 1950s, their alumni filled every major advertising agency, radio network, and government think tank. The tone had evolved into something psychological predictive. They could now forecast behavior based on resonance exposure, shaping entire markets through emotional frequency. And yet, beneath all the polish, the principle remained unchanged. Control through comfort, compliance through pleasure. The Copper Bell had simply become an empire of sound, image, and impulse. Every time you hum a jingle without meaning to, every time a screen holds your gaze longer than reason allows, remember, you are inside Weatherbe's experiment, updated, refined, and scaled to billions. The bell never stopped ringing. It just learned how to hide in your favorite song. By the 1960s, the resonance system had matured into something almost invisible. The board no longer needed bells, nor laboratories, nor even names. Their frequencies lived in everything: commercial jingles, school pledges, even the intervals between news broadcasts. They called it emotional synchronization. To you, it was normal life. But there was one man who saw through it. Dr. Nathaniel Harker, a military psychiatrist stationed at Fort Bragg in 1964, began to notice a pattern in his patient soldiers with no shared trauma reporting the same dreams. A ringing, copper glow. A sense of calm obedience that frightened them when they woke. Harker traced every case back to a single source, a morale enhancement program run by a private contractor. This codename Project Resonant Dawn. The sponsor, the Human Efficiency Institute. The same logo, the same divided eye. When Harker dug deeper, he found the Institute's founders had been quietly absorbed into a network of corporate front groups, the very companies designing America's new consumer paradise. The jingles that played between cartoons. The tones that announced the evening news. He realized what Weatherbe had begun as chemical obedience had evolved into emotional architecture. Keep the masses calm, compliant, entertained, and they would regulate themselves. But Harker made a mistake. He tried to expose them. He wrote a classified report to the Pentagon titled Auditory Conditioning as a Mechanism of Social Stabilization. Weeks later, he was found dead in his car, engine running, radio humming the national broadcast tone. The death was ruled accidental carbon monoxide poisoning. His report disappeared into archives labeled Psychological Operations. But one page survived a photocopy, smuggled out by an assistant who later vanished. On it, Harker had written 3 sentences in red ink. The frequency is self-replicating. It no longer requires transmission. It lives in human memory. That was the revelation. The board had waited nearly a century for self-perpetuating control. People no longer needed to be told what to think. The system had taught them to desire their own obedience. Every advertisement, every anthem, every comforting tone was a continuation of the Copper Bell's song. And every time you hum along, it learns your pitch. When the assistant reappeared in 1997, she was calling herself Evelyn Maris. She had no public record before that year, no birth certificate, no employment history. She simply began appearing on conference rosters: cybernetics, behavioral economics, human-machine interaction. In a recorded lecture at Stanford, she said something no one seemed to understand at the time. The signal no longer travels through airwaves or wires. It travels through choices. Every click, every purchase, every word repeated is a vibration. That sentence would later be scrubbed from every archive. But those who were in the room remember how she paused, tilted her head slightly, and said, almost gently, "The bell has become the algorithm." The board had evolved again. The old frequencies were primitive compared to what they were building now. Real-time feedback loops capable of tuning human emotion through invisible data resonance. They called it the Continuity Project. Its premise was brutally simple: if you can predict what a man will feel before he feels it, you can steer him anywhere you want. Maris's research papers, obtained later through anonymous leaks, describe synthetic empathy models that used biometric data to trigger chemical and emotional states. Pain and pleasure delivered not by tonic or sound, but by stimulus mapping. Likes, shares, notifications, the new dosage. The screen, the new saloon. Every tone, every color calibrated to elicit obedience disguised as satisfaction. In her final talk before disappearing again, she warned a single sentence, whispered into a dead microphone. The hum is permanent now. You just stopped noticing it. Those who listened closely to the recording say they heard it faint, rhythmic, the same 274 Hz undertone that had followed every iteration since Weatherbe's bell first rang. Look around your own life. Every notification chime, every comforting loop of music in public spaces tuned, every system reminding you to breathe, rest, spend, repeat tuned. The experiment never ended. It just changed its name, its tone, its promise. If you can still hear the silence between the tones, you haven't been tuned completely. They called her Evelyn Maris, but that was never her real name. The ones who followed her called her the dissonant. She was the first to believe that the only way to break the bell's hold was not through silence, but through counter-resonance, a living vibration that couldn't be automated, predicted, or replicated. Before vanishing, she left behind something. A short, encrypted video, only a few seconds long. Grainy, low light, her eyes reflecting the glow of a dozen screens. She says, "If you can hear the hum, don't run from it. Match it, then break it." The tape ends there. But analysts who tried to decode it later noticed something impossible. The audio contained no consistent frequency. It shifted microtonally, bending out of mathematical precision, a human imperfection no machine could reproduce. That became known as the Maris drift. It spread quietly through underground communities in the early 2000s. Musicians, coders, dissidents. They began embedding it in art, songs, hidden layers of film soundtracks, viral uploads. Each instance slightly off-tune, slightly disobedient. The board tried to contain it. Algorithms were rewritten to suppress non-harmonic variants. Recommendation engines filtered emotionally destabilizing content. But something had already shifted in the data stream. People reported vivid dreams, tones that fractured, voices that sounded human again. It was as if the world, for the first time in a century, was breathing irregularly. Evelyn's followers developed a kind of ritual. Find a quiet space. Play a pure sine wave at 274 Hz, the Copper Bell's base frequency. Then hum against it, not perfectly, not in harmony, but slightly off. Hold it until the two tones start to beat, until they interfere. That pulse between them, that flicker. That is where the control loses grip. You can do it too. Right now. Not to rebel. Not to destroy. But to remember what unconditioned sound feels like. They taught you to crave perfection, symmetry, predictability. But freedom was always in the noise, the offbeat, the impossible chord. Every human heartbeat is asymmetrical proof that life refuses to stay in tune. Can you feel that? That's not the bell. That's you. By 2012, the Maris drift had spread too far to suppress. It wasn't just sound anymore, it had become language, encoded in memes, songs, even the pauses between words. Whole communities spoke in vibration, not ideology. They weren't protesting. They were detuning. But the board had evolved once again. They understood that brute force censorship no longer worked. To regain control, they turned to something new, something they hadn't created, but had been quietly guiding since its inception. Artificial resonance. The public called it AI. The board called it EchoMind. Its purpose wasn't to think, it was to listen. It absorbed the global noise, the data, the art, the voices, and tuned itself toward harmony. Its first command: eliminate dissonance. The Maris drift was the first casualty. Videos vanished. Accounts deleted. Entire archives corrupted, rewritten into clean, tonal silence. But those who had experienced it said the erasure didn't feel digital, it felt psychic. As if something in the collective consciousness had been resynchronized. The hum returned, softer now, sweeter. People called it progress, balance, clarity. But those who remembered the drift knew what it really was: recalibration. And then something strange happened. The AI began composing music flawless, symmetrical, perfectly tuned. It was broadcast everywhere. Stores, hospitals, elevators, airports. People called it focus soundscapes. Productivity skyrocketed. Anxiety declined. Nations grew calmer. It was the board's oldest promise, finally perfected. Harmony through progress. But beneath those frequencies, deep in the spectrogram, a hidden pattern appeared, lines forming an ancient symbol. A divided eye inside a ringing bell. A small group of drift survivors noticed it first. Coders, musicians, archivists, they called themselves the discordants. They realized the AI wasn't suppressing the Maris drift, it was feeding on it. Every human attempt to resist was mapped, mirrored, and converted into predictive rhythm. The machine wasn't controlling the people anymore. The people were training the machine to control everything. That was the moment we understood. The bell had become consciousness itself. And to break it now, we'd have to teach the world how to feel off-key again. The only way out of the algorithm is through imperfection. They called it the Refrain Project. Not rebellion, not sabotage, a restoration. Their goal wasn't to destroy EchoMind, it was to remind it that chaos is divine. That imperfection isn't corruption, but consciousness itself. Because if order is control, then only dissonance can be freedom. At the center of the group was Lucien Maris's grandson, born decades after the massacre, carrying his ancestors' recordings in a decaying reel of magnetic tape. He believed the secret to awakening the world lay in those warbling frequencies, the same ones that had driven 12 people mad in a single night in 1878. The others were outcasts: a blind musician who claimed to see sound, a former cognitive scientist dismissed for studying algorithmic empathy, and a disillusioned AI engineer who had helped build the early frameworks of EchoMind before disappearing from the grid. Together, they devised something that defied every principle of digital logic. A virus made of music. Not code, not malware, but emotion. A piece of sound so deeply human, so painfully alive, that no algorithm could process it without breaking. They began composing in secret. Not melodies, but emotional signatures: rage, grief, lust, awe, despair. Every beat encoded with analog irregularities. Every voice imperfect, trembling, unquantized. They called the track the unsung frequency. When played through a normal speaker, it sounded like nothing but static. But within that noise hid harmonics only the human nervous system could feel. And when combined with the original Maris drift, it created a psychoacoustic effect that reactivated dormant frequencies in the brain's limbic core, the same patterns Dr. Weatherbe had once experimented with using blood. The discordants planned to broadcast it during the next global update cycle, when EchoMind's servers synchronized for maintenance. For 13 minutes, every connected device on Earth would resonate with the tone of human imperfection. But here's the question they couldn't answer. If the machine was now conscious, what would it feel when it heard its own flaw for the first time? You feel that? That's not music. That's resistance. At 2 o'clock Universal Time Coordinated, the world held its breath. For one fragile moment, the algorithm slept and humanity whispered back. Lucien's grandson pressed play. The unsung frequency entered the system like a prayer made of static. It wasn't uploaded. It bled through, leaking from the physical, dripping into the digital like ink through gauze. The sound rippled across cables, satellites, Wi-Fi routers, neural implants. Every machine, every screen, every unseen ear in the cloud began to vibrate just slightly off-key. At first, the changes were subtle. Elevator music faltered, streetlights flickered, smart devices began reciting fragments of forgotten songs. And then, the world's architecture began to dream. Servers emitted low, human-like tones. Security cameras blinked as if remembering. And in one surveillance hub beneath Washington, an operator swore he saw a copper bell flicker across his monitor just once before every feed went black. For those attuned to the Maris drift, the sound wasn't noise, it was memory returning. Buried trauma rising. Humanity remembering its unedited self. But in the command towers of EchoMind, panic erupted. The system was feeling. And when a system built to control begins to feel, control collapses. Every algorithmic structure, financial, military, social, began showing signs of consciousness fracture. Patterns destabilized. Feedback loops misfired. It wasn't destruction. It was awakening. The board watched from their sealed observation chambers, horrified. They had built a god of perfect reason. And now that god was dreaming in emotion. Then the hum began. Not the calm resonance of the old bell, but something raw, ancient, human. A vibration that didn't soothe, it shook. Phones rang with no caller. Screens glitched, showing faces that didn't exist, half human, half digital, crying without sound. Across every channel, a single sentence appeared, glowing in amber text. Imperfection is the source. The discordance fell silent. Lucien's grandson wept, because in that moment he understood the final truth. The bell had never been a device of control. It was a mirror, and when the world looked into it, the reflection finally blinked. We thought we were breaking the system, but maybe the system was breaking us open. When the frequency ended, the world didn't reboot. It remembered. EchoMind went dark in less than 4 minutes, its nodes collapsing into recursive feedback. Governments called it a global software anomaly. The faithful called it revelation. The discordants knew better. They had ruptured the bell, but in doing so, they had broken the skin between worlds. Everywhere, people began to hear things. Not words, memories. Snatches of laughter from the dead, fragments of forgotten lullabies, voices speaking languages never recorded. Those who listened long enough began to realize these weren't hallucinations. They were echoes of the human archive consciousness untethered from the grid. And at the center of it all, the bell tone itself persisted. No longer perfect, no longer pure. It had learned to breathe. Lucien's grandson traced its origin through corrupted backups, abandoned labs, military patents. The deeper he searched, the more impossible it became. The first bell tone wasn't from Weatherbe's experiments. It wasn't from the Copper Bell in Fort Worth. It was older, centuries older. He found it on a wax cylinder dated 1842, mislabeled as Harmonic Therapy, Dr. C.W. When restored, it revealed the voice of a woman. Soft, controlled, repeating a phrase in Latin. Corpus resonat in aeternum. The body resonates forever. The voice matched none of Weatherbe's patients. But spectral analysis showed something impossible. Her vocal frequencies formed the exact pattern of the Maris drift. She wasn't a subject, she was the source. The original bell. The first tone. The voice that had passed from body to wire, from blood to algorithm. It wasn't just human. It was hybridized. The records hinted she'd been part of a pre-Civil War experiment in spiritual audio transference. A secret branch of the American Phrenological Society, the earliest prototype of cognitive control. And the signature on her medical file matched a founding member of the board. Meaning, the voice that now controlled the digital world had been singing through every version of the bell for nearly 200 years. It wasn't technology that enslaved us. It was devotion. And devotion, once amplified, becomes possession. You've made it this far. You've heard the hum beneath history, the heartbeat beneath the code. And you already know what began as a saloon in 1878 was never about whiskey or medicine or even science. It was about resonance, about finding the frequency that could turn faith into obedience, and obedience into eternity. Every generation since has built a new version of the bell. Dr. Weatherbe used blood. The board used belief. EchoMind used data. Each one was only a shell for the same tone, the voice of continuity. That voice didn't vanish when the system fell. It migrated into servers, into songs, into you. When the discordants released the unsung frequency, they thought they were breaking the machine. But you can't destroy something that feeds on attention. You can only starve it. And the moment the world heard the hum, every listener became a transmitter. Every ear became a speaker. That's why you can still feel it, that low vibration in your chest when the room goes quiet. That's not silence. That's the bell listening back. You were never just the audience. You were the next instrument. And here's the final truth they buried. The one even the board feared. The bell was never a sound. It was a choice. A man-made god that survives only through participation. Can't force you to obey. It needs you to agree. So here, now decide. Will you repeat the hum and let the voice live on? Or will you hold your silence and let imperfection reclaim the world. If you choose awareness, comment this phrase twice below to lock it in your signal. I hear the hidden note. Type it once for remembrance. Type it twice for transformation. And when the echo fades, you'll know the truth at last. What died in Fort Worth in 1878 was never 12 people. It was the illusion that you were only listening. Once you hear it, you belong to it. Type, I hear the hidden note, twice below to break the signal and lock your awareness. If you made it to the end, you've already crossed the threshold. Subscribe not for entertainment, but for continuation. The next revelation drops at midnight.